Hi, everybody. This is Mark Hunt. Hey, I know we're at this moment in September 2021 looking to finalize site plan for Riverside Park, and there was some interest in gathering some more detailed thoughts from me about how various access sites in the area and launch ramps and so on work. So I threw together this quick and dirty video tour of some sites in Buncombe and elsewhere. Thanks for joining in. What I hope folks get out of this video first is just to observe and learn from the way some facilities elsewhere have evolved, what works well with them, and some things that don't work so well. I think you'll pick that up as we go. Here is a map of the sites in Buncombe County we're going to look at. You can click back to this map if you end up getting confused about where we are in the tour. At the end, we're going to go outside of Buncombe County up into Madison County on the French Broad and jump maybe to another river or two. And then finally at the end, I'll lay in just some perspectives and thoughts about the specifics of Riverside Park and where we might be headed with that. So let's get started. Thanks. We'll do this tour going from downstream to upstream. So our first stop here is going to be at the site for Silverline Park, which, as you know, is under construction. Here's a master plan view. And let me just point out a thing or two. There'll be a 30-foot wide trailerable ramp in this project. A 30-foot wide ramp is important, I think, mainly because it allows room for a vehicle, say a van and a trailer or a truck and a trailer, to back down on one side of it and still leave 15 or so feet of width for people on feet to move to and from the river. And that's a big deal because vans and vehicles with trailers can occupy that spot for several minutes. There's also going to be changing rooms and restrooms planned within the current building that's on there that will be remodeled. Let me highlight that Silverline is 1.5 miles upstream of Riverside Park. And so let's keep in mind the distance between those two. It's actually a fairly short float. Some people will do it, but most people that get on the river tend to want to go, maybe 4, 5, 6 miles in a single trip. So some use going from Silverline down to Riverside, I would anticipate, but there'll be more use coming from upstream headed for Riverside Park. Here we are at the site of French Broad Outfitters. That's that green roofed building. And right next to it, a City of Asheville owned parking lot and access site. A little more about the layout here. French Broad Outfitters uses this green grassed field here for its customer parking as well as those spaces around its building. Some French Broad Outfitter customers park in the Asheville turnaround lot, and these areas get completely filled up and frankly overwhelmed on busy days. Our tour, by the way, is, I think it was about 10:30 or so in the morning on a Saturday. The peak hours for all these sites we're looking at are going to be more in the 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon range. So we're not seeing the river or these sites at peak use on this Saturday in July. In terms of restrooms here, there are men's and women's rooms inside the French Broad Outfitters building. There are porta-johns that French Broad Outfitters places on site in the main season. City of Asheville does not provide restrooms here. And as you can see, the parking areas are either grass or gravel. These are not paved areas. Shifting gears to the access, as you can see here, there's a stairway with railing that goes from the City of Asheville parking area down to the river. And to be honest, I'm not a fan of this design for a couple reasons. First of all, when people are carrying kayaks, stand-up paddleboards, inner tubes, etc., steps are not ideal because people's vision and their ability to see the steps can be blocked. They're sometimes carrying heavy loads, and steep stairways like this can be hazardous. This is, of course, a difficult site because of the grade change between the parking and down to the river. So steps probably have to figure in some way or another. As you can see, the users that are coming out of the river, coming up the bank, are avoiding the stairway. The stairway's wide open. They're choosing to go on the grass. That's creating erosion. They're doing that for two reasons. The first is they just would prefer to walk on ground instead of the steps, especially that person with the armful of inner tubes. But the other thing is, if you look down at the bottom here, you can see that there is a beach that these folks have, a gradual sloping sandy beach these guys have used to get out of the river. That end of the steps down there is not a functional place for people to get in and out of the river. And the reason is that the steps end right at the edge of the water. The water is maybe, a foot or so deep right at the edge of the steps. And of course, that last step is situated maybe a foot above the water level. So stepping up out of a silty, sandy riverbed onto a step that's a couple feet higher than where your lower foot is just doesn't work out. And that's why I favor sloping ramps to allow access into rivers. They allow for changing water levels, and everybody knows where the bottom is. And finally, you can see that the water is a little bit muddy today, and anybody that's standing at the end of the step looking down is not sure how deep that water is or what's beneath it. And in fact, at this site, there are some loose, chunky boulders right around the area in the river where one would step off. So we'll talk more about steps versus ramps and so on later, and we'll see more examples as we move move upstream. Here we go. We've moved just about a quarter mile upstream, and this building with the arrow is the location of Zen Tubing. Zen rents, I believe, just inner tubes and nothing else, and they do high volume. You can see that they've got a little bit of parking around their location here. They have a set of rough, steep steps that goes down to the water. It's a lot like the City of Asheville site we just looked at. Zen actually rents this field up here, which is maybe a 250, 300 yard walk for many of its customers. When they have busy days and they fill up their lot at their building, they direct folks up to that field up there. And so between French Broad Outfitters and Zen Tubing, they may have a combined parking capacity, including that Asheville lot of, what do you think, maybe 200, 250 cars, and they absolutely fill those up. And again, I've made the point earlier about how it's in Woodfin's interest to see folks park on private sites and elsewhere, and that Woodfin should not attempt to provide all the parking necessary to service the demand of users in Woodfin. As we move upstream, but Salvage Station is a somewhat popular place for folks to access the river. Salvage Station is not an outfitter. I don't believe they have any rentals of tubes or other river gear. However, because of the beer and because of the generous parking, especially during the daytime, folks like to park there, stage their trip either headed downstream or coming from upstream at Salvage Station. And Salvage Station does have an access site. It's actually a gentle one. It's at the mouth of a creek that borders their property. Easy to get in and out there, kind of a ramp-like effect and not a step. They do have a couple of steps up onto the main site from that creek bed, but it's just one more place where the demand for parking and river access is served in Asheville, not by an outfitter and not by a public park. Here we are in the River Arts District, and right next to the Craven Street Bridge is what I'm going to call the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission ramp and parking area. The history of this site is that when City of Asheville was implementing the $75 million rad tip project, they were able to line up a grant from NC-WRC to fund the construction and development of this particular access site. NC-WRC actually designed and built it to their own standards with a little input from Asheville, but it was largely a state-run project to implement this. Little detail, there's limited parking here, obviously. There are 5 sites for vans and trailers or buses, trucks and trailers. Of course, NC-WRC is about fishing in this context, as well as regular recreation on the river, but they wanted to make sure this functioned for fishing. Thus, the trailerable ramp and the parking sites to accommodate. This site is popular with some outfitters. Asheville does not have licensing or formal relationships with outfitters, so there's a little bit of a free-for-all nature when it comes to outfitters operating in these different sites. Let me highlight another thing about the parking here. You can even see in this photo to the lower end, there are some parallel parking spots along the sidewalk. There are actually, I'm going to guess, maybe 200 to 300 parking spots within about a quarter mile or so of this site. So public parking is readily available along the edges, curbside along sidewalks. There are a couple more city-owned lots, and there are some private sites like the Wedge Brewery not far away that people park on and sometimes use this site to get to. So ample parking in the area, and therefore I don't think the limited parking on this site is that big a deal. Let's turn our attention to the ramp. This ramp is a narrow one. It's about, I want to say, perhaps 12 feet wide, maybe 15 feet wide. And it has width enough only for a vehicle with trailer to back down it, or alternatively, people accessing by foot. But I've been there when there's been a vehicle stage there, putting a boat in or taking it out, and it's very difficult for people to get by on the edges. So my take is that this ramp is not wide enough. You can see that the pavement or the concrete here is scored on a diagonal angle here. That is for traction. It's a rough surface. When we were at Nantahala, some of us, a couple months ago, we saw that users of the river there, particularly the folks with rafts, did not appreciate concrete quite this rough because it abraded the rafts and perhaps tubes and plastic kayaks and so on. Finally, there is a dock here. I was actually at some of the public meetings with Wildlife Resources Commission officials questioning why there would be a dock here. There are no motorboats, but Wildlife Resources Commission staff said, well, we always put in docks at every site we ever do. And who knows, maybe there will be motors there if we put a dock in. Well, the French Broad River is just too shallow for motors. I have never seen a boat tied up to this dock, although I'm sure it happens occasionally. And I just don't think a dock has much function. It's floating too high off the water for any kayaker or tuber to use it to get in and out of a boat. If it's a raft or a drift boat, yes, it could be functional there, but rafts and drift boats work fine just using the ramp itself. Not a problem. So any thoughts that we might have about putting docks in Woodfin, I would suggest let's not do that. Onward. Just, maybe only 200 yards further upstream from the Wildlife Resources Commission ramp is Gene Webb Park. And you can see parts of Gene Webb Park, particularly that little trail that leads to an access ramp, the left side, but the parking is here underneath the Haywood Road Bridge that extends across into West Asheville. Like the Wildlife Resources Commission lot, there are very few parking spots available here in Gene Webb. But again, lots of public parking, some of which you can see parallel parking along the curb and that lot to the right there. So again, folks don't mind walking a little bit. This is not a trailer accessible ramp. There's a footpath that extends over to this combined set of steps with interesting rails. The rails are functional because it allows people to slide a kayak or canoe or even a raft maybe from up at the high grade down toward the edge of the water. My comments here about these steps are the same as I had earlier back at the site near French Broad Outfitters, and that is that steps are not necessarily as safe as they should be when it comes to people carrying heavy boats and bundles of tubes and things up and down. And as you can see in this photo, this video, there are rocks and uneven riverbed, and again, a big step up out of the water to the steps. So again, for those reasons, I'm not a fan of steps. Here we are at French Broad River Park. And by the way, both the Gene Webb Park and this park, French Broad River Park, were developed in a partnership of sorts between RiverLink and the city of Asheville years and years ago. The Gene Webb Park was recently updated with the RAB tip, and this is the original configuration of French Broad River Park. So again, here we have just limited parking. There's not a lot in the way of nearby public parking, so this particular lot gets pretty filled up and overflowing with cars. There's often congestion there and spillover onto side streets and so on, and I know that it is a point of concern for Asheville police and others that we've got that overflow that comes along here. My take is that this site is generous enough. There could have been more parking designed in on the front end, but it is what it is. From a river access standpoint, this park is a little odd. As you can see, the parking is down here at, I guess, the south end of the park, and the river access steps, which I don't have a picture of, sadly, are located up about here. So anybody wanting to access the river at this site is faced with going to the parking lot, assuming they can find a spot to park, and then carrying whatever craft to or from their vehicle through almost the entire length of the park to get to the remote steps. I don't understand why the steps were placed so far from the parking, because that generally doesn't work. Better river access sites have parking near the access point into the river. And again, those are steps up there. They're a lot like the steps that we've seen in prior sites. Here we go, upstream. We've turned onto Amboy Road, heading westward at this point a bit, having crossed the bridge, Amboy Road Bridge, and along Amboy Road. And this has got two components. First, on one side of the road is the Smoky Mountain Adventure Center. It has a climbing wall, but also rents craft for the river, and they do a pretty good business in all this. You can see that on the opposite side of the street parking area, there's the Greenway Trail bordering the river. That is City of Asheville property, and City of Asheville developed that lot. If we go just upstream from the parking lot along the Greenway, we see there's an observation platform overlooking the river. People fish from that occasionally and just hang out and enjoy the river. And a little further upstream, maybe a total of 150 yards upstream of the parking lot, is the access ramp. Access steps that we see here. Again, I think this would have been a great place to put in a modest ramp. A little bit about parking here. Limited parking in the Asheville lot. Again, not a trailerable ramp, so vehicles with trailer sites not a big deal here. On very busy times, we see folks pulling off roadside onto the grass to parallel park up and down. And many of those are Smoky Mountain Adventure Center customers that have overflowed from their lot and are parking along the edge of the road. Again, that I know that some vehicles, for instance, park with their wheels out on the pavement and are left, and that becomes an issue for City of Asheville police. So we drive along past the rest of Carrier Park, and that site we just looked at is the only launch site within Carrier Park. But I'll point out that there are other parking facilities in Carrier Park, and folks have made their way to the edge of the river and created their own, let's call them goat trails, down to the edge of the water to launch. So there are informal launch sites, several of them within Carrier Park. And that's problematic because when people clamber up and down the bank to get into the river and out, it creates erosion, and that erosion exposes tree roots of nearby trees, and those trees are more likely to fall in the river once the bases are eroded like that. So I think that Carrier Park near these other parking areas probably could have used an additional access site and some measures to keep folks off the banks. At the upstream end of Carrier Park, just beyond it a little bit, is AVL Outdoor Center. AVL Outdoor Center has been around for many years, preceding most of the actually launch sites on public property that we've been visiting, but it's a private outfitter, privately owned. Their setup is to have folks park in this big grassy field here, as well as that area that is gravel nearby. Some days their site is filled to the brim with cars and vehicles, and they, of course, transport folks by bus upstream above the Biltmore Estate to float down to here, and then they have folks float downstream to some of the public sites in the city of Asheville that we've covered, and they pick them up there. Their access facilities into the river are made up of this set of steps here. This is the last site in Buncombe County we'll look at, and this is the confluence of Hominy Creek flowing into the French Broad River. And we're at the end of Hominy Creek Road and the location of Hominy Creek Park, which is that parking area on the left. It is a Buncombe County park. It happens to be in the city of Asheville, but it is a Buncombe County owned and maintained park. It also is the terminus of the French Broad River Greenway that you can see extending downstream through the trees here. So this is a popular site for people to launch on the river and people to journey to on the Greenway, or perhaps park at and get on their bikes or get on foot and use the Greenway. This park area is immediately adjoining it is another site for French Broad Outfitters. We saw that they are located also at Pearson Bridge Road. This is actually a county-owned piece of property leased to French Broad Outfitters, and they have substantial parking within their site. Of course, they rent rivercraft, and there are lots of users that, again, like to begin their trip here. Also on that site is food, beer, refreshments, and entertainment. They've got actually a small stage, and on late afternoons, evenings, on the weekends, they often have local bands playing. There's disc golf holes here, and it's a popular place for people just to go hang out. The final thing I'll say about this site is that the parking between French Broad Outfitters and Hominy Creek Park does not nearly meet the parking demand. Upstream of this site is about 4 miles of Biltmore Estate property. So there's nowhere upstream convenient to go and launch. And so this is the most upstream end of all the launching. Riverside Park will be the most downstream end of all the taking out. So interesting to think about it in that context. But pretty heavy overflow parking up and down this road. It's so tight and narrow down at the park site that there's often traffic jams and congestion of vans and trailers trying to turn around, buses occasionally. It's a mess, and there are nerves that are frayed among users trying to get on the Greenway or get in the river or get to French Broad Outfitters to hang out, and it's kind of overwhelming at times. So just something to take note of as we head on elsewhere. We're going to make a trip to Madison County and take a quick look at the Section 9, as we call that stretch of river access facilities. Now, Section 9 of the French Broad includes Class 3 whitewater. It's not a tubing and stand-up paddleboarding stretch so much. It's really more of a skilled paddlers and outfitted stretch with raft guides, with guides that take trips along. So a different kind of use than in Asheville, but there's a bit to learn from looking at their facilities there. And by the way, this is a Madison County government developed and maintained facility. As you can see, there's room in this parking lot for, what do you think, maybe 100 cars total once it's full, and it doesn't really fill up that hugely. I think the biggest days on Section 9 and the use of this facility may see perhaps 500 people move through here onto the river, which is, I think, a good bit fewer than the loading we'll see in Woodfin at the park sites there. But having said that, layout of the site includes what used to be public changing rooms and restrooms. As you can see on the right of this photo, there's a building there that has been closed for many years. Perhaps 15 or 20 years ago is the last time I saw the doors open on that. I think it was just built inexpensively. Perhaps the field line system failed or something. I don't really know the history there, but there have been porta-johns next to it for all these years. And there are no changing rooms at this site. So it's, given the use volume and the people coming from a distance to get here, it's a little limited as to those facilities. The parking area, of course, here is gravel. It holds up really well because it is owing to the fact that this parking lot is fairly flat. It only slopes slightly enough so water doesn't puddle up. But the gravel has done well here for many years. At each end of the parking lot, there are generous turnaround areas for vans and trailers and buses. And there, because of the outfitter use here, there's quite a bit of trailer and bus type traffic that comes through here. I'm down near the river looking up at the parking area, and you can see that there's a concrete retaining wall that was designed into this site with generous wide sets of 2 or 3 steps at a time. Now, these steps obviously do not go down into the river. They're just for getting from the parking lot and down. The width of these steps is great because people carrying rafts, as we see in this picture, are able to negotiate it. And the fact that there's only 2 or 3 steps, makes it pretty reasonable. But that retaining wall serves to help ensure that the parking lot is level, and also that people stepping from that grade down to the next are not eroding any banks as they do it. So I kind of like that setup right there. Now, looking at ramps down into the river, I think early in the going, Madison County government wanted to use natural surfaces and inexpensive approaches, so they used this, I think it's called geotextile fabric, to help retain the crushed stone that they used to surface this ramp. But as we can see over the years, the floods have eroded the ends of these ramps, and I believe there are 4 of these geotex type ramps that are designed in. Each of them are about 15 feet wide or so, and they're not really for vehicles because vehicles can't access them given the steps and the retaining wall. You can see there's evidence of folks finding their own way to the edge of the river despite the availability of these ramps, and this is a particularly eroded spot here. gosh, 20 years ago, that little cove or that little area that is eaten away into the bank was not there. There were actually a couple of trees there, back 20 years ago or so. Here you can see we've got a mix of private users, canoers, kayakers, etc., and rafting folks outfitting use. Another of those ramps there. Again, this is actually a concrete one you can see extending down. However, if we go to back to the upstream end of this site, we see this ramp here, which is in fact trailerable. It's about 15 feet wide, I suppose. So only functional for one vehicle and trailer at a time. But that's fine because there are all these other ramps throughout the park that allow for access. So an interesting perspective here is that there are a total of maybe 6 different designed, implemented ramps, totaling perhaps 70 feet or so in combined width. And not all of them are busy at any given time, but it makes for convenience because of the broad parking lot and people accessing the river along the breadth of it. They probably could have or even should have focused all this foot traffic and access into maybe a total of 3 ramps that were perhaps more generous, all paved with concrete. That way we wouldn't have the erosion and maintenance problems with the natural surface and folks accessing between the trees and so on. There have been a number of trees lost in this park, as I said. Now, what we just looked at was the put-in site, the starting point for trips on Section 9 of the French Broad, the Class 3 section. And now we're about 4 miles downstream of that at a place called Stackhouse, and we are on U.S. Forest Service property here. And the Forest Service has developed a site for access on a very limited site. It's divided into 2 main areas. There is what we call the private access area down in this area where there are a couple of beaches. That log in the picture actually drifted there in a flood. It's not designed to be there, but that little site there could conceivably accommodate a vehicle with a trailer accessing down in, assuming they can negotiate the rest of the lot where it's kind of narrow and there are other cars parked. But yes, a van and a trailer could back down this lane and get to there. Now, further upstream on the site is a generous area that is for outfitters only. It's actually, you're not supposed to park private user vehicles here. We see some vans parked here with trailers, and that site there used to be trailer accessible, but I guess the silt and mud at the edge of the river made it so that folks were not being successful with in and out of it with wheels getting stuck in the mud and so on. So they put the rocks up to keep people from backing down in there. And at the far upstream end of the entire site are a couple of pit toilet or vault toilet restrooms in this very durable building. The entire building, including the roof, is made of cast concrete and assembled on the spot. Underneath it are big tanks that pump trucks come and clear out, I think, on about a weekly basis. And also at the upper end, near those restrooms, is this wide set of steps. The steps, it's kind of hard to see, are about 12 feet wide enough so that people can carry on each side of a raft can carry a raft up and down these steps. And at the bottom of the steps is this wide apron. You can see a recent flood has silted it over a little bit. It tends to clear itself off with rains. It's slightly sloped. And while the ramp does not extend down into the river, the natural riverbed tends to have plenty of natural gravel in the river washed up onto a sloping shore here. So there's really no need to extend the concrete way down into the water here. The surface is firm and people can walk on it. And because of the sloping nature, it's easy to access. So that's section 9 of the French Broad. Let's go ahead and wrap up. The tour, I hope, was instructive. We learned a little along the way. I want to add a few comments, suggestions, and opinions, so take them all for what they're worth, but this has been helpful for me to think through all this clearly. Let's talk about use volumes and patterns, and I'm going to break it down by user groups and attempt to quantify numbers and where they'll want to be in the park. And I'll start with the traditional users of Riverside Park: picnickers, walkers, dog walkers, kids on bikes, fishermen, users of the pavilion for birthdays, etc. We want to make sure that this park is functional and welcoming to that group. That group might total 200 people a day, but it's dominated by Woodfin citizens, and it's just important to have the park function for them. There are going to be wave users, people that drive here and want to get on the wave with their surfboard or kayak. That's going to number in the dozens or a couple hundred a day. There are going to be spectators that come and are curious and want to watch the wave, which is great. That's intended. And that group may number in the hundreds in a given day as well. Moving up to larger scale, we've got through users of the river, people that have started at one of those many sites upstream and want to end at Riverside, which is going to be the most popular place on the river to end a trip, just like Hominy is the most popular place to start. And I'm just going to guess that we may be seeing 1,500 or so users want to finish their trip each day below the wave on busy days, and that's a lot of people. Of course, the mill at Riverside might absorb some of those users depending on what their plans are for the future, and I'm not sure they even know themselves yet, so that's to be determined. But at any rate, we got to make sure this park works in a reasonable way and that we scope the number of people that come through it. So at 1,500 users, I think we can divide that group into the private users, people with their own craft, and transport them to the river, versus outfitted users. And I think I said last week that I think outfitted users will be greatly outnumber the privates. Then we'll have through users of the Greenway, or folks that want to use the Greenway. Many of the people wanting to use the Greenway will want to park at Riverside Park, but they can also park elsewhere and go up and down the Greenway on bikes or rollerblades or running, whatever. And that may be in the neighborhood of 2,000 people a day, would be a rough guess on my part, based on observations elsewhere. So lots of people in the park. I think the park can handle all this, but it's got to be optimally designed, and we've got a really good start on that, of course. As far as the through users on the river, that's been much of our focus today. I think it's pretty apparent that a ramp is going to be vital, not just to allow the flow of people and to avoid bottlenecks, but to make sure our banks don't get eroded and steps can't function for certain types of boats. And we know the Army Corps and the Wildlife Resources folks expect us to put in a ramp. And so I hope we all agree on that. I think a ramp 30 feet wide to allow for a vehicle and trailer, as well as people on foot taking in and out, is important. I think parking for a few buses, vans, and trailers is really important, because the way we're going to keep people from needing to park at Riverside Park will be to have those people park at outfitter sites and come in vans and buses and whatnot and leave that way. And that really alleviates parking demand for the park. There was some discussion last week of moving the ramp from the spot in this site plan downstream a little bit, maybe about where that W is on the site plan or thereabouts, to separate it and spread things out a little bit. And that's a great thing for the design team to consider and look at. It would perhaps save several big, healthy, mature trees that provide a lot of shade and are nice in the park. Let's shift our attention while we're talking about parking to that upper parking lot. I want to point out a couple things about it. It won't be functional for the bulk of the through users of the river. The reason is that they'll need to get in and out on the ramp, which is about 250 yards downstream, and carrying rafts or tubes or paddleboards or anything from the ramp way down there up to the upper lot going uphill is just not going to be a popular or very functional thing. So our intention for that upper lot probably should be for the other users, and that could be the wave users, the wave spectators, the traditional users of the park, and to the extent that we can have signage or other ways to help people decide where to park depending on their use, the better we'll be, I think. The restrooms are an interesting consideration to me, restrooms and changing rooms. Right now we envision a large restroom changing room facility being located upslope on the upper level at the letter I. My take is that we're going to have more users down in the ramp area. The volumes of people getting off the river, needing to change clothes, needing to use the restrooms are going to be down at that lower downstream ramp area. And I had put in a comment earlier that maybe the restroom should be, or the new larger restrooms changing room should be down that way. And I wonder about siting them somewhere in the between the R and the S indicators on the map. I know that'll be lower down deeper in the floodplain, and that may be a problem for locating the restrooms down there, but maybe not. I think they would be more functional. And if we move the restrooms down to that site, which is kind of halfway between the parking areas, it would maybe allow us not to even build the new restroom, smaller restrooms down where the letter V is indicated near the ramp. The other thing is, when you have restrooms right next to a parking lot, there are folks that will be driving up and down Riverside Drive that will use this as a rest area. And, you know, I've been in Riverside Park and seen that several times an hour where people just pull in to use the restrooms and keep driving. And that adds to crowding. It's not why we're building a park either. So moving along, I just one point that I'd like to make about the beaches next to the wave. Those are intended for, and Scott would tell you this, those are designed and intended for people using the wave to access in and out with their kayaks, surfboards, and etc., which is only a few users a day, and you know, in the dozens or 100 or two maybe, which those beaches can handle. They are not intended for the through users of the river to take rafts and drift boats and inner tubes and stuff out, although some of that will happen. Those beaches are also intended for kids and families and whatnot. Back to the upper lot for a second. One idea I threw out was that perhaps some of those spaces could be designated as 90-minute spaces, ensuring turnover for parking. So maybe a third of the spaces up there, or even half of them, could be designated 90-minute spaces. And that would ensure that walkers and traditional users of the park would have more of a chance of getting a spot. The thing I would be concerned about is that parking lot fills up early in the day with greenway folks and with through users of the river that leave their cars there for hours and hours, and that kind of precludes others from getting in the park. Let me shift over to cost. I know that there's the concept of developing Riverside Park in 2 phases, and the ramp was originally indicated to be in phase 2. I think it really needs to be in phase 1 because of the demands and uses as we've discussed here today. But in my mind, ways that we might defer cost into a phase 2, in addition to some of the landscaping and other things that Equinox has already recommended, I wonder about leaving the new parking areas in gravel at first instead of paving, which is expensive. Perhaps not installing the curbs for the parking lots on the front end either. I wonder about deferring all the new restrooms to a phase 2 and go with porta potties for a while. Perhaps building permanent changing room stalls, which are less expensive than restrooms with their plumbing and all that. on the front end, but maybe deferring the restrooms till later. I wonder about deferring the Grand Pavilion structure till later in phase 2. And one thing about deferring these key items to phase 2 is that when the park opens after phase 1, it'll be very apparent to people that it is only partly done. And there'll be a desire on everybody's part to see the parking lots paved and see the permanent restrooms brought in and so on. And that will light a fire under the next round of fundraising we would need to do to get all that done. And again, I think that, phase 1 being built and maybe a couple years later, phase 2 being done would be a fine way to wrap things up. So I hope this has been informative. I hope that nothing I've said today is critical of our approaches here. I actually think Silverline Park and Riverside Park are in excellent shape, headed toward great designs and to be great parks. They will be the jewels, the crown jewels of parks along the French Broad River in Buncombe County and beyond, and something that the town of Woodfin and all of us can be very proud of. And I'm really excited that we're making the progress we are. Thanks for listening and watching. See you soon.